The Somme wasn't a battlefield. It was hell with mud for skin. The ground had forgotten what solid meant. Rain, artillery, and the churn of 500,000 boots had turned French farmland into a churning bog that swallowed men whole. Trenches collapsed hourly, communication lines severed, rifles clogged with filth after 3 shots, and everywhere the smell, rotting sandbags, cordite, latrine pits overflowing, and beneath it all, the sweet, sickening stench of death baked into the clay. In this wasteland, survival wasn't about courage. It was about inches, about keeping the trench wall from burying you alive, about finding one dry spot to chamber around before the Germans came over the top. And on the morning of July 3rd, in a flooded communication trench east of Mametz Wood, private named Thomas Hale was about to prove that the difference between life and death could be built with scrap wood, wire, and a miner's stubbornness. Thomas Hale wasn't supposed to be a soldier. He was born in 1892 inches, a cramped terraced house in Durham, England, where coal dust settled on everything: windowsills, bread, the lines in your father's face. His father worked the pit. His grandfather had died in one. By age 12, Thomas was underground too, pushing carts through tunnels barely tall enough to crouch in, breathing air thick enough to chew. But Thomas had a gift. Not for academics or charm, he was too quiet for that, too tired, but for times seeing how things held together. When a mine tunnel threatened to collapse, it was Thomas who carved angled wooden props from salvaged beams, wedging them at precise angles to distribute weight. When a support snapped during a cave-in, trapping 3 men, it was Thomas who crawled into the dark with a handsaw and a lump of candle wax, cutting braces on the spot, holding the ceiling long enough for them to dig free. His mates called him Timber Tom. Not because he talked much, he didn't, but because when something was falling apart, Thomas Hale knew how to shore it up. He didn't read engineering manuals. He just understood pressure, angle, and improvisation the way a pianist understands keys. By 1915, war had come, not with fanfare, but with conscription notices slipped under doors like eviction papers. Thomas received his in March. He didn't protest, didn't wave flags. He just kissed his mother, promised his younger sister he'd write, and reported to the recruiting station in Durham with the same grim resignation he'd felt descending into the mine every morning. He was assigned to the Royal Engineers as a sapper, a military miner, because of his background. For 6 months, he dug tunnels beneath no man's land, laying explosives under German trenches. It was the closest thing to home he'd found in the war. But in June 1916, manpower shortages hit. Entire battalions had been ground to dust in earlier offensives. The call came down. Reassign surplus engineers to infantry units. Fill the gaps. Thomas Hale became Private Hale, 18th Battalion, Durham Light Infantry. No more tunnels, no more controlled demolitions. Just a rifle, a shovel, and orders to march toward the Somme. The Battle of the Somme began on July 1st, 1916, with the largest artillery bombardment in human history. For 7 days, British guns had pounded German lines. The generals promised the wire would be cut, the defenses shattered. The enemy demoralized. They were wrong. When the whistles blew and 100,000 British soldiers climbed out of their trenches, German machine guns untouched, buried deep in concrete bunkers, opened fire. Men fell in rows. Some battalions lost 90% of their strength in the first hour, the worst single day in British military history. Nearly 20,000 dead, 40,000 wounded. Thomas Hale's company wasn't in the first wave. They were held in reserve trenches 2 miles back, listening to the distant thunder, watching stretcher-bearers stumble past with men whose faces had been torn away. On July 2nd, they were ordered forward to relieve a shattered unit near Mametz Wood. The communication trench they were supposed to use, a vital supply line designated SAP 14C on the maps, was supposed to be clear, reinforced, functional. It wasn't. When Thomas and his company arrived at dawn on July 3rd, they found a disaster. The trench was flooded. 3 feet of brown water mixed with oil, blood, and floating debris. The wooden duckboards that lined the floor had been blown apart by shellfire. Worse, the walls built from sandbags, wooden frames, and clay were collapsing. Entire sections had caved in during the night's bombardment, burying ammunition crates, blocking passage, creating death traps. Sergeant Mills, a hard-eyed veteran with a face like carved flint, surveyed the mess. "We hold this trench. No retreat. Supplies come through here, or not at all." The men stared. Hold it? It was falling apart, but orders were orders. They waded in. The trench was a coffin waiting to close. Every few hours, German artillery would scream overhead, pounding the sector with 77mm shells. Each impact sent shockwaves through the saturated ground. The trench walls, already weakened, would shudder, crack, and slump inward. Sandbags slid into the water. Wooden braces snapped like kindling. Twice that morning, sections collapsed completely, burying men up to their chests in mud. They had to be dug out by hand, coughing, half-drowned, while shells continued to fall. The company had been issued standard engineering supplies, wooden planks, iron stakes, sandbags, but most of it had been destroyed in transit or was now underwater, swollen and useless. The few intact planks were too long, too heavy, or splintered beyond use. Meanwhile, German machine guns covered the open ground above. Climbing out to find materials meant death. Staying in the trench meant being buried alive. Panic crept in. One private, barely 18, his uniform caked in filth, turned to Sergeant Mills. "We can't stay here, Sarge. The whole thing's coming down." Mills spat into the water. "Then dig faster." But digging wasn't the problem. The problem was structure, weight, engineering, and no one in the company knew how to solve it, except one man. Thomas Hale sat on a half-submerged ammunition crate, staring at the trench wall. His hands, calloused, scarred from years underground, rested on his knees. He wasn't panicking, he was calculating. He'd seen this before, not here, not in France, but in the Durham coalfields, where tunnels sagged under pressure, where one wrong move meant the ceiling came down and you never saw daylight again. The trench wasn't that different from a mine shaft. Both were holes in unstable ground. Both needed support at the right angles to distribute weight. Both would kill you if you guessed wrong. The official army braces' vertical posts hammered straight down were useless here. The ground was too soft. The posts sank or toppled. You needed times angled, times support. Diagonal braces that pushed back against the collapsing wall, transferring pressure down into firmer soil. Thomas stood, waded through the water, examined the collapsed section. The wall was sagging inward at the top, like a mine tunnel after a tremor. The sandbags were too weak, the stakes too shallow. He needed something stronger, something angled. He looked around. Shattered duckboards floated in the water, splintered, but some pieces were still intact. Strips of corrugated iron from a destroyed supply shed lay half-buried nearby. Barbed wire, cut loose from entanglements, coiled like rusted snakes. Thomas pulled his entrenching tool from his belt, a small flat spade, and began cutting. Sergeant Mills noticed first. "Hale, what the hell are you doing?" Thomas didn't look up. He was sawing a duckboard plank into 2-foot sections with the serrated edge of his bayonet. His hands moved with methodical precision, the same way he'd carved mine props in the dark. "Making braces, Sarge." "Braces? We've got braces, they don't work." "These will." Mills frowned, but he didn't stop him. Thomas worked fast. He took the cut planks, sharpened one end with his bayonet, and drove them into the trench wall at a 45-degree angle, wedging the bottom into the firmer clay below the waterline. Then he lashed them to vertical stakes using barbed wire stripped from the entanglements, twisting it tight with his entrenching tool until the whole structure locked together. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't regulation, but it held. The first brace went up in 20 minutes. Thomas tested it, threw his weight against it, stomped on the base. It didn't budge. He moved to the next section, then the next. Other men began to notice. A corporal waded over. "That actually working?" Thomas nodded. "Show me how." By midday, half the company was cutting planks, driving stakes, lashing wire. Thomas moved between them, adjusting angles, pointing out weak spots, his voice calm and steady. Not straight down times angle times it. Push back against the wall. Lock it at the base. Sergeant Mills watched, arms crossed. He didn't say much, but when a shell landed 30 yards away and the trench shuddered times and the new braces held while the old sections collapsed times, he walked over to Thomas. "Where'd you learn this?" "Durham coalfields, Saga. Same problem, different hole." Mills grunted. "Keep going." By late afternoon, they'd reinforced 50 yards of trench. The walls still leaked, water still pooled. But the structure held. Men could fire from cover without being buried. Ammunition could be moved without losing crates to cave-ins. For the first time since they'd arrived, the trench felt like something they could defend. At 6:47 p.m., the German artillery barrage intensified. Shells screamed in 77 mm, 105 mm, some big enough to lift entire sections of earth into the air. The noise was apocalyptic. Men crouched low, hands over ears, teeth rattling in their skulls. But the trench held. Thomas's braces angled, lashed tight, driven deep, flexed under the impacts but didn't break. Dirt cascaded down, sandbags slumped, but the walls stayed up. Then, at 7:15 p.m., the shelling stopped. Silence. Worse than the noise. Sergeant Mills raised his whistle. "Stand to." The men scrambled to the firing step, rifles raised. Through the smoke and dust, shapes emerged, grey uniforms, helmets, bayonets fixed, German infantry. Counterattack. They came in waves, advancing through the shell craters, using the smoke for cover. 100 men, maybe more. Fire. The Lee Enfields cracked. Bolt actions snapped. Brass casings pinged into the water. Men fired. Reloaded. Fired again. The Germans pushed closer. 50 yards, 40. One section of trench reinforced with Thomas's braces became the anchor. Men firing from stable positions. Rifles rested on solid walls instead of crumbling mud. They could aim. They could reload without sinking. In contrast, the section's times without times braces collapsed mid-fight. Men struggled to chamber rounds while knee-deep in sliding clay. Some abandoned their positions entirely, forced back by caving walls. But Thomas's section held. The Germans broke against it like a wave against stone. Machine gun fire from a Vickers team, positioned in the one stable corner Thomas had shored up that morning, raked the attackers. Bodies crumpled. The advance stalled. At 7:51 p.m., the Germans fell back. The trench sap 14C, the flooded, collapsing death trap had held, not because of artillery support, not because of reinforcements, because a miner's son from Durham had refused to let the walls come down. In the days that followed, other units noticed. Word spread. The Durham boys have a trench that doesn't collapse. Engineers visited, examined the braces, copied the design. Within a week, variations of Thomas's angled supports appeared in trenches across the sector. Some called it Hale's method, others just called it the Durham brace. Thomas never asked for credit, never explained it twice. When officers questioned him, he just shrugged. "It's what you do in the mines, sir. Angle the support. Distribute the weight." Sergeant Mills recommended him for a military medal. The paperwork got lost somewhere between battalion and brigade headquarters. No medal was ever issued, but the men in his company didn't need a medal to remember. Years later, one of them, a lance corporal named Davies, would write in a letter, "Thomas Hale survived the Somme, he survived Passchendaele, he survived the final push in 1918, he returned to Durham in November 1919. Thinner, quieter, with a persistent cough from gas exposure. He didn't march in parades, didn't talk about the war. When neighbors asked, he'd just nod politely and change the subject. He went back to the mines for a while until the 1930 seconds, when his lungs finally gave out. Then he opened a small carpentry shop on the edge of town, built furniture, repaired fences, taught his nephew how to cut a proper mortise joint. He married late a schoolteacher named Margaret and had one daughter. He never told her about the Somme, never mentioned SAP 14C or the braces or the night the Germans came, but every few years, a letter would arrive. From Wales, from Scotland, from Australia, always the same. Asterisk, I was there. In the trench. Your wall held. Thank you. Thomas never replied. He'd just fold the letters carefully, tuck them in a drawer, and go back to work. He died in 1964, in his sleep, in the same house where he'd been born. No monument. No plaque. His obituary in the Durham paper mentioned he'd served in the Great War, but gave no details. Most people forgot, but in a few scattered homes across England, on mantelpieces, in photograph albums, old men kept faded pictures of a flooded trench, a muddy wall, and a memory of the quiet private who refused to let it fall. War is remembered in monuments and numbers. The Somme, 1.5 million casualties. The Battle of Mametz, 4,000 British dead in 3 days. The statistics are overwhelming, numbing. But wars aren't won by statistics. They're won by the private who stays calm when the trench is collapsing. By the miner who remembers how timber braces work underground. By the man who builds times when everyone else is breaking. Thomas Hale didn't storm a machine gun nest, didn't capture enemy ground. His name appears on no official list of heroes, but for one company, in one flooded trench, on one terrible day in July 1916, he was the difference between survival and burial. That's the paradox of the Great War. It was the largest industrialized slaughter in history, fought with millions of men, thousands of guns, endless tons of steel, but in the end, it was often decided by small things. A miner who knew how to shore up a wall, a piece of duckboard, angled just right, a refusal to give up when everything was falling apart. History forgets most people. It has to. There are too many names, too many faces, too many moments lost in the mud, but that doesn't mean they didn't matter. Somewhere in France, beneath a farmer's field, the remnants of SAP 14C still lie buried. The wooden braces have rotted, the wire has rusted, the men who fought there are gone. But the principle remains. When the world is collapsing, when the walls are caving in, and no one knows what to do, sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to accept that nothing can be done. One person who sees the problem differently. One person who builds. Thomas Hale didn't wait for orders, didn't wait for engineers or manuals or approval. He just picked up a saw, cut some wood, and started building. And because of that, on one terrible day in July, a wall held, and men lived. What shocked you most? Comment below. Share this story with someone who thinks one person can't make a difference. Thank you for watching.